Memorial Day. All right, let's just make sure all of our technology is working well here. There we go. Welcome, everyone. My name is Jenny Ponzuric, and I hope everyone's having a great day off from school today. I know there's definitely some school psychologists out there who are writing reports today because school's not quite over for them quite yet. And they got to get a couple of things done, even if it is the weekend. I know some of you might actually already have your students out for the summer. It's so interesting how different school districts have such very different days, last day of schools, weeks apart from one another. All right, well, today I just wanted to drop in and talk a little bit about these D words, dyslexia, dyscalculia, and dysgraphia. And kind of just wanted to talk about it in the lens of our wonderful field of school psychology, which I've been a part of for over 20 years. For those of you who do not know me, was a school psychologist, was an administrator. Nowadays, I get to do a lot of consultation and trainings. I get to talk a lot about learning disabilities. So definitely these terms come up. We've done a lot of conversation. I know over the last couple of years, I practice mainly in California. I live in Southern California. I get to do lots of trainings all over the state of California. And of course, over the last couple of years, the word dyslexia has been used a lot more frequently within the school settings. There's a lot of conversation I know all over the nation around the word dyslexia. And then, right behind that term is a lot of times with different parents, sometimes teachers, dyscalculia and dysgraphia. So I just wanted to give a couple of quick tips that I find to be helpful when I have families that are bringing up these terms and sometimes school staff that are bringing up these terms. So I always like to reflect on my history in this wonderful field of school psychology. And I remember early on in my career, if someone said the word dyslexia when I was a school psychologist, I would say things like, we don't talk about that here, right? Like that's a medical term, right? Like you need to go talk to your doctor about that. And we kind of just pushed it away. And nowadays we're like, come talk to us about it. Like, let's get into this. It's very different nowadays, very different nowadays. So let's go ahead and talk about the first tip here. We, of course, are going to have parents, sometimes teachers, sometimes admin who are talking about these words, dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia. And so one of the things that comes up is, how do I respond to that request? I will never forget, and I can hear her voice inside my head, of a parent talking to me and asking, can you talk about dyslexia? Are you going to bring it up in the meeting? Are you allowed to write about it in the report? It was very specific questions, really talking about this word dyslexia. And so one of the things that I have found to be most useful anytime anyone is using these words is to pause and check in on what is the definition that this person is using. So we think about like the word dyslexia. There are people out there who still are focusing on like BD reversals, whereas if you're using a definition from like the International Dyslexia Association, we're talking about, difficulties with accurate and fluent word recognition, right? Very different kind of perspectives there. And I want to make sure that when I'm responding to just even the question, are we going to evaluate these areas? What do you mean by these areas? Another thing that comes up sometimes, anytime someone uses the word dysgraphia, whether that's a fellow school psychologist that I'm consulting with or a parent brings up the term, I find that the word dysgraphia kind of is in two major categories. Some people are using the word dysgraphia to talk about the actual legibility of writing. Like my student just has a hard time writing. And whereas other people are talking about, no, they just can't get their thoughts down on paper. And again, before I start just jumping in and talking about that, I want to make sure that I understand what they mean by that term. So a lot of times I will kick off that conversation with something like, there are so many definitions of dyslexia, of dysgraphia, of dyscalculia. What do you mean by that term? so that I can make sure that I'm going to be responding accurately, whether I'm responding right there, am I going to test for this? But more importantly, if we are going to move forward with an evaluation in the public school system, that I know what specifically this reason of referral is, and do we have all the right people on this assessment team and all those different things. I would hate for me to think I knew what they meant by that term, and then we get to the meeting and they meant something very, very different, right? So that I think can be a real helpful stance for me. That's been really helpful for me, including when I talk to teachers as well. Again, I have some teachers that I work with that when we use the word dyslexia, they still talk about like seeing the word saw as was. And I'm like, oh, that's not really how we describe that anymore. But there's so many definitions that are swirling out there about that. So I think one of the things that has been most useful in regards to making sure that my teams understand that it's okay for us to talk about these words in the public school system, very different than 20 years ago, is there's this great document that was written by the U.S. Department of Education back in October 2015, and it's typically referred to as a Dear Colleague letter, right? Sometimes there's questions that are posed to the U.S. Department of Education, and they just kind of like write back to all of us. And in this letter, that starts with Dear Colleague, it actually makes a reference to all of these terms. And it says within that document, within that letter, that we're allowed to use these words in meetings, and actually indicates that if we think it would be kind of the way I think about it, if we think it would add to the conversation, that maybe we should bring up some of these terms. I have not had that instance yet, but I know that I'm allowed to, right? And that we're able to use these words in our report. But specifically in that document, it also says, we're really looking at whether or not the child's eligible for special education, right? Like that's a separate conversation there, right? We can use these words, but we're also going to be looking at whether or not the child is eligible for special education, most likely under specific learning disability. So if you've never seen that document, feel free, just go ahead and Google U.S. Department of Education, Dear Colleague, October 2015. And if you still can't find it, go ahead, just go to my website right here, jennyponzuric.com. If you scroll down almost to the very bottom of the front page, there's a place where you can ask a question, and I'm very happy to send you the document. So if you can't find it in our fun Google world, then just let me know. I'm happy to share that with you. So the second thing then, of course, is if we are going to move ahead and evaluate, once we've all kind of gotten on the same page in regards to a definition, really making sure that we understand all the things that go into reading success and all the things that go into math success and writing success. As a school psychologist, depending on your state and how they look at eligibility, how they look at learning disabilities, whether it's more through an RTI or a discrepancy or, a pattern of strengths and weaknesses approach, if you are evaluating those processing areas that contribute to success or difficulties in these academic areas, that's where we want to make sure we're really feeling really comfortable with that. Right? And I like to be very transparent. I learned a lot in my grad program over 20 years ago. But one of the things that really struck me as I came out of my graduate program is I really don't feel like we had a big emphasis on how students typically develop reading skills and how like the typical development. Maybe it was a quick moment. Maybe I'm just don't remember. It definitely wasn't a big, in my mind, enough emphasis with learning disabilities, at least in my state, being the largest category of eligibility, really making sure that we understand like what are all the processes that go in to reading being, a successful endeavor for a student. And especially understanding, when we're talking about reading and we're talking about math and we're talking about writing, what kind of skills are innate and what kind of skills or processing abilities need to be explicitly taught, right? So when we think about reading, phonemic awareness skills, while our brain is definitely ready for it, it's not born with the ability to just automatically be like, oh, I know how to do blending and segmenting, right? Like those skills have to be explicitly taught. And so one of the things I always think about is, I don't know when we'll ever get away from reflecting on that less than ideal instruction year where we had building closures and, instruction over Zoom and hybrid learning and all those different types of things, is really questioning for our younger elementary school students right now, how much did that impact their ability to learn those phonemic awareness skills, because those need to be explicitly taught. Whereas something like in math, the ability to just kind of generally estimate, and I love these examples, I was just reading about this, and they said, our ability to just kind of estimate, we're standing in line at the grocery store, which line looks to be the shortest. That's like more of an innate ability to kind of just estimate those things. I don't know what happened to my brain. I always get in the wrong line. I always get behind the person that they look like they're going to be done real quick, but they are not going to be done real quick. So I think my estimating skills are good. I just don't always think about how quickly that person's moving through the line. I don't know. So one of the things, of course, that's really important is that if we're going to talk about dyslexia or dysgraphia or dyscalculia, that we really understand what goes into success within these areas. And those processing skills are really helpful. Those academic areas, I think, are super helpful too. We have so many different tools that are available for all of you whose districts use standardized achievement testing, from something like the WJ and the Wyatt and the KTA, our big broad test, to, much more specific tests that are just looking at writing or just looking at math skills. In most of the districts that I have worked in over my career, our ed specialists are the ones who are doing the achievement testing. But one of the things that I have found to be most useful is, of course, to understand the achievement testing that they're using. Twofold. Number one, part of my role is to integrate and synthesize everything together. So I need to make sure I understand how exactly the Wyatt is looking at reading skills or how the KTA is looking at writing skills, so that everything's going to make sense, right, with my assessment or evaluation results. And the other thing that I think is really important, because there are more narrow band achievement tools that are becoming available. We have a lot more dyslexia related tools. Dr. Stephen Pfeiffer has a number of tools that are just focused on reading, math, or writing. Many of you are familiar with the test of written language or the key math. Is for me to understand, well, do we need to give that? How is this tool looking at those skills differently than maybe the broadband achievement test that, was being used by my ed specialist? And I know I was consulting with a psychologist a couple of weeks ago about the same question. They had just recently gotten, one of these, more narrow band achievement tools. And the psychologist was wondering, do we need to evaluate? Do we need to administer this? And one of the questions was, how are those subtests different than what the team has already looked at? Right? Because in this case, we were looking at writing, but there was also an occupational therapist that was involved. And I said, go show the OT this, cool new tool that we have. Is there anything that's on there that the OT is not covering? Right? Because there's no reason to overtest students, right? But if there was something unique going on with this test that wasn't being examined by anyone else on the team, well, then we might want to look into that. Right? So really making sure we understand all the different processes, academic and processing skills that go into success into these academic areas, and then also understanding our tools, right? Whether it's the achievement tools or our different processing tools. And then lastly is really thinking about how can we discuss these areas in our report? Because what we know is typically in our psychoeducational reports, near the end, we're talking about eligibility for special education, right? So we're using our definition of a learning disability and whatever model for SLD identification that our district is utilizing or our state is utilizing. And so we've got that language there. So where exactly does this conversation about dyslexia or dysgraphia, where am I supposed to put that in my report? And I don't know about all of you who may have tried out some different things. For me, what I like to do is I like to talk about it in the summary of my report. That's what makes most sense to my brain, because by the time we got to the summary, then we've got all the other information that now I can just refer back to, right? So if we're talking about something like dyslexia, well, I can talk about phonemic awareness and rapid naming skills because that was already on these pages. And I can talk about the decoding and the spelling skills because we've already talked about all those other pieces earlier in the report. So it's just my way to kind of synthesize that. Now, I have been doing a lot of conversations about these different terms in the last couple of years. And one of the things I've definitely found is that depending on what state you work in, what district you work in, you might already have some clarification about, like, this is the definition we use when we're talking about this word dyslexia. So I'm going to use me, of course, as an example. So I work in California, and when I think about working in California from a state perspective, we do have the word dyslexia in our state regulation language. It's sitting there, but there's never been a definition there. However, a couple of years ago, our State Department of Education put together a dyslexia guideline. Many states have dyslexia guidelines. And from there, there's a definition that's adopted there. So when I'm talking about how do I talk about this within my report, I just reference back to the definition that was adopted or utilized in the state level document. Now, if you go to words like dysgraphia and dyscalculia, they're not in our state regulation language in California, and we don't have the California dysgraphia guidelines yet. Like, we don't have any of those things. So then you got to take it from a different perspective. If my state doesn't have that, does my state association maybe have a definition? Does my region or my district, have they already talked through this kind of stuff? So I have definitely, in my exploration of different states and their documents, seen certain states that actually have, like, this is the definition we use for dyscalculia, and this is what we use for dysgraphia. And I'm like, oh, I wish I lived in a state that had some clarification about these different definitions. I only have one for dyslexia right now. And so in those kind of cases, as I've been consulting with other districts who are also in California that don't have these like go-to definitions, well, let's adopt a definition then at a district level. Right? That could be one way to approach that. If our state association, our region, if we don't have anything to grab onto, can we go to a school psych job alike meeting? Can we talk through this? Can we look at the different definitions that are swirling around out there? And can we agree as a group that if someone's going to talk about dyscalculia and we want to talk about it in our report, well, let's have some kind of common definition, at least within our district, so that we're all responding in a very similar way, at least within our district. So that's actually what I have been working on lately, is really coming up with some different language here, because this is the best way for me to hold myself accountable. I have been talking about the word dyslexia for years, and I've definitely shared with a lot of different districts how I talk about it in my reports. Again, I practice in California. We have the California Dyslexia Guidelines. There's a specific definition. And in my head, I've always been like, you know what would be great if we came up with some samples to reference dyscalculia and dysgraphia. And so this is the best thing that I can do to hold myself accountable, is I told some people many months ago now that in our summer boot camp 2023 that I would have a session on this. So we are having a session on this. Those of you who have been to some of my lives in the last couple of weeks know that registration is open for summer boot camp 2023. This is a 2-week kind of mini PD virtual sessions. It's going to be July 10th through the 21st. And every session starts at 10 o'clock in the morning Pacific Standard Time. It runs about 90 minutes to 2 hours. We're kind of giving our presenters a little bit of flexibility about how much time they want to do in their presentation of information, whereas also having some time for open Q&A as well. So this has also been an interesting one for me, because sometimes I talk about just dyslexia for 3 hours. So to be able to talk about all three of them in 2 hours or less is also something that I'm working on here. So how do I get some great information to cover those different things that I just talked about? What are some common definitions that are out there? What do we know about the processing and academic areas to make sure we're doing those comprehensive evaluations? And then what are some ways that if your state, your district doesn't have a definition to attach itself to, what would be a way to do that so that we could still feel really comfortable and confident responding to it within our report or aloud at a meeting, right? Every once in a while we have parents who choose not to say anything until the middle of the meeting, and then all of a sudden we have this word that's thrown out there. We want to make sure we're responding to that. So it's also very fresh in my head because I've been working on creating these materials and gathering all this information. I still have got, I keep reminding myself, many weeks to go until I actually have to do this presentation. So it gives me an opportunity to continue looking through different tools. I'm just looking around my desk, all these books I have that I've been looking through, just to make sure that I'm feeling good and comfortable about a slightly newer topic here, right? So for those of you who have not seen any of our stuff about summer boot camp, you can go to my website, and right there on the front page, you'll see a button right there that says summer boot camp. You can see all the information there. We have 5 sessions that kind of focus more, we call it the newer school psych. And then we have 5 sessions that we're calling improving my practices. And you can sign up just for those 5, or you can sign up for all 10. We really worked to keep our registration costs very low, so that students are able to afford it. Those of you who are just finishing, who are still paying off your student loans, that you would be able to access this. Now, a couple quick things I want to mention before I go and let everyone have a great barbecue or whatever you're doing on this Memorial Day is, number 1, yes, we are recording everything. So if you are thinking that you might take a vacation in July and you're not going to be hanging out live with me, we are recording everything, and everyone will continue to have access through the end of October. Okay, so that's number 1. Number 2, for those of you who are still hanging out in your school district, we also do accept purchase order forms. So if your district is interested in kind of paying your way through this, we do have that form right there on our registration page as well. All right, so there's a button right there that says, yes, we do take purchase orders. Click right there and you can see the form. And as always, if anyone has any questions about summer boot camp, anything that been talking about here today, feel free to just go ahead over to my website, scroll about almost all the way to the bottom, and there's a place to ask me questions, and I would be happy to answer them. All right, go have a great rest of your day off, and those of you writing reports, I'm sorry, but we're almost there. We're almost there, right? All right, I will see you all later. Have a great day, everyone.